The story we all know is an apocalypse. In the year 1258, a horde of savages poured into Baghdad, the richest city on earth. They pulled down its palaces, burned its mosques, and killed its people in numbers no one could count. They emptied the great libraries, 5 centuries of learning, into the Tigris. The water, the tale goes, ran black with ink for a week. In a handful of days, the Islamic Golden Age was cut off at the root. A civilization murdered by barbarians, that is the story we all know. It is also wrong. The real version is colder. It is administrative. It is far more frightening than any horde. This was not a monster who destroyed a city. It was a machine that processed one. On one side stood al-Musta'sim, the 37th Caliph of the Abbasid line. He was the spiritual head of the Sunni world, heir to a chain of authority reaching back 500 years to the companions of the Prophet. But the office he held was a hollow thing. His command barely reached the walls of his own capital. He ruled a dynasty of shadows, trusting that the holiness of his title was a wall no army would dare to breach. On the other side rode Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of the reigning great Khan. Hulagu was no raider chasing plunder. He was an imperial officer sent west with a multinational army, and one order that could not be argued with: bring the last powers of Western Asia to their knees. This was not a negotiation. It was a final notice, carried at the head of the most efficient war apparatus the world had yet produced. So this is the trial of Baghdad. The charge is the murder of a civilization. Over the next hour, we put that crime on the stand. Part 1 lays out the case for the prosecution, the evidence of a slaughter so total it closed an age, told through the horrified chroniclers who lived it. Part 2 calls the defense. We hold those same witnesses up to the light, examine the true state of the victim, and question the real motive of the accused. Part 3 delivers the verdict. We weigh what was actually lost in the ashes of 1258, and we meet the inheritors, the ones who rose from the wreckage to claim whatever was left standing. The answer is not the one you were taught. It is stranger, and it exposes a dark truth about how empires really die. History is written by the victors, even when the victors are the ones who burned the books. Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and support the work. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The prosecution begins its case not with a sword, but with a sheet of paper. It reached the caliph's court, carried by Mongol envoys who had ridden hard from the north. And the language on it was not the language of a warrior. It was the language of a man collecting a debt. Hulagu Khan wrote as an instrument of his brother, the great Khan Monkey, and he set out the terms with the patience of a clerk reading from a ledger. They were simple. They were routine. They were the exact terms handed to every city, every fortress, every kingdom that had stood in the empire's road from the steppes of Mongolia to the mountains of Persia. Those terms had a history the Caliph should have studied. 2 years earlier, in 1256, Hulagu had ridden against the Ismaili strongholds in the Elburz Mountains, the fortresses of the men Europe called the Assassins. Their leader, Rukn al-Din Qurshah, held the great castle of Alamut, a nest of stone thought impossible to take. Hulagu offered him the same ledger of terms. Rukn al-Din surrendered, was paraded across the empire as a broken trophy, and was then quietly killed on the road east. Alamut, with its own famous library, was pulled apart stone by stone. The Persian historian Juvayni, who rode in Hulagu's train, was allowed to walk that library before it burned and to carry off a few volumes. He watched the rest go into the fire. Anyone at al-Musta'sim's court who cared to read the recent past could see exactly what the Mongol offer was worth and exactly what refusal bought. The Caliph was to pull down the outer walls of Baghdad. He was to fill in the defensive moat that had ringed the city for generations. He was to come in person to the Mongol camp and bend the knee. He was to accept a Mongol overseer in his capital and submit his people to a census, so that every household could be counted, registered, and taxed like any other in the empire. Do these things, the letter said, and his life would be spared. His property would remain his. His position as a holy figurehead would be preserved. Refuse, and one question hung at the bottom of the page like a blade on a thread. How could he expect heaven to stand with him? It was a threat folded inside the cold arithmetic of an audit. Al-Musta'sim read the words and saw only insolence against God. His reply was not the reasoning of a ruler weighing his survival. It was a sermon. He reminded Hulagu that the house of Abbas was shielded by the hand of the Almighty. He listed the kings who had raised their arms against the caliphate across 5 centuries and pointed to the ruin each of them had come to. He summoned the whole of the Muslim world in his imagination, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of China, and swore they would rise as a single body to defend the commander of the faithful. Then came the line that revealed everything about the man. "You are a young man," he wrote, speaking down to the grandson of Genghis Khan as a schoolmaster speaks to a boy who has only just appeared on the scene. He told the Khan to turn his horses around before he brought a disaster on his own head. The court around him was already fracturing. His chief minister, the vizier Ibn al-Alqami, a Shia scholar of considerable learning, urged compromise and the paying of tribute. Against him stood the Dawatar, Mujahid al-Din Aibak, master of the pen and sword, who wanted to fight. The two men despised each other, and their feud ran straight through the palace at the moment it could least afford one. The year before, in 1256, a mob had sacked the Shia quarter of Kark, and Ibn al-Alqami had watched his own people plundered while the court did nothing. Sources say the caliph had recently cut the standing army to save money, dismissing troops whose wages he did not want to pay, on the advice of men who told him God would provide the rest. Later, Sunni chroniclers would accuse Ibn al-Alqami of treason, of writing secretly to the Mongols to weaken his own city. Whether that charge is true or a scapegoat's legend is a question the defense will return to. What is certain is that Baghdad walked toward its end, divided against itself, and stripped of the men who might have manned its walls. The Caliph believed he was reaching for the most powerful weapon on earth, the 500-year sanctity of his office. He did not grasp, even now, that he was speaking to a system that did not acknowledge his God, did not recognize his title, and did not care about his history. He was firing a theological argument at a war machine. Hulagu's answer took only a few lines. He promised the Caliph a fate that would make him regret every word he had written. Then the letter stopped. The negotiation was closed. The machine had been switched on. What now moved toward Baghdad bore no resemblance to the ragged horde of legend. It was, by any honest measure, the most advanced military organization on the planet. Hulagu's army was less a raiding party than a corporation of conquest, assembled from every province the Mongols had swallowed. At its heart rode the Mongol cavalry, the finest horsemen the world had yet seen, men who had spent their lives in the saddle and could shoot from it at a full gallop. Around that corps stood the auxiliaries, Armenian heavy cavalry under their king, Hethum I, who saw in the Mongols an ally against Islam and sent his own son-in-law, Prince Bohemond of Antioch, to ride with them. Georgian fighters under their own banners, who fought hardest of all. Persian and Turkic levies, who knew the rivers and roads better than any invader could. But the piece that mattered most was not made of horsemen at all. Hulagu's column carried a corps of 1,000 siege engineering teams drafted from northern China. These were not warriors. They were technicians, men who had given their entire lives to a single science: how to bring a wall down. They traveled with catapults broken into transportable parts, with tubes and tanks for throwing burning naphtha, with an understanding of leverage, weight, and stress that no defender in Baghdad could match. They were the specialists you send when demolition is the only outcome permitted. The force advanced in 3 great columns, a coordinated pincer designed to cut Baghdad away from Syria in the west and from Persia in the east. Every ford across the rivers was taken, every road was choked off. The city was being sealed inside a shrinking ring, isolated from the world before a single arrow struck its walls. This was not the chaos of a sack. It was a protocol, unfolding step by step. And the city they were closing on was still, in that winter, one of the wonders of the earth. Baghdad had been founded by the Caliph al-Mansur in the year 762 as a perfect circle, the round city, its walls laid out by astronomers who chose the hour of the first brick by the stars. By 1258, it had spread far beyond that original ring, sprawling across both banks of the Tigris, joined by pontoon bridges of boats lashed together. Its markets carried silk from China, ivory from Africa, paper from mills the Muslim world had learned to build from Chinese prisoners of war centuries before. Its call to prayer rose 5 times a day from hundreds of minarets. Into this city, the ring of iron drew tight. The Caliph still thought his strength was real. He had an army, after all. On parchment, it looked respectable enough, perhaps 20,000 soldiers. He placed them under his commander, Mujahid al-Din Aibak, and sent them out to meet the Mongol vanguard and remind these strangers what the might of the Caliphate looked like. It was the last field army the Abbasid dynasty would ever raise. They marched from the gates full of confidence and met a Mongol division on the west bank of the Tigris, near the town of Anbar. At first, the numbers held. The Abbasid troops pushed forward. They drove the Mongols back across the ground, and for a moment it must have felt as though the Caliph's faith had been proven right, as though God had put his hand on the scales. But the Mongol retreat was not a retreat. It was a rope being played out. They fell back and back, drawing the Abbasid soldiers deeper into the low, flat land that lay along the river, ground that sat below the level of the canals. When darkness came, the trap closed. Upstream in the black, the engineers broke the dikes that held back the Tigris canal system. Water surged into the floodplain behind the Caliph's army. The camp turned first to swamp, then to a shallow lake. The soldiers woke in rising water, their armor dragging them down, their horses floundering in the mud. There was no line to hold and no dry ground to stand on. When the sun rose, the Mongols came back. They did not close for battle. They stood on the firm earth at the edge of the flood and loosed their arrows down into a trapped mass. Nearly the whole Abbasid army was destroyed without a proper fight. A handful of survivors, the commander among them, dragged themselves back to the city. Baghdad's last shield was gone. It had not been shattered by strength. It had been dissolved by men who understood water better than the men defending it did. Now the siege proper began, and it too was a technical exercise, carried out with the detachment of engineers on a schedule. The Mongols reached the walls in late January of 1258 and split their strength between the two banks. Hulagu himself took the eastern side. His general Baiju held the western. The plains around Baghdad were rich alluvial soil, good for crops, but they held no stone for building or for throwing. To the Chinese teams, this was a supply problem, nothing more. They located quarries in the Jebel Hamrin Hills, well to the north, and set up a chain to haul heavy blocks of rock down to the siege lines. When even that ran short, they smashed the foundation stones of buildings outside the walls and hurled the city's own masonry back at it. Other crews went to work on the palm groves lining the river banks, cutting the trees down by the thousand to feed the frames of the war engines. Around the whole city, they raised a palisade and dug a ditch, a wall built outside the walls so that no one could slip through and escape. Then the bombardment opened. From the east, stone and fire fell without pause on a single chosen point in the defenses, the Jami Tower. For 6 days and 6 nights, the catapults worked, never resting, hammering the ancient brickwork in a rhythm that never broke. The sound became a thing you could feel in the chest, a constant shock that carried through the streets and into every house. Between the impacts came the drier crack of the naphtha throwers, and the smell of it hung over the eastern quarter, oily and sharp. Inside those houses, the people of Baghdad waited, listening to the steady drumbeat of it. Some tried to flee across the river by boat at night. The Mongols had anchored a pontoon downstream and strung it with catapults and nets, and the boats were caught in the open water and sunk with the people still in them. On the 10th of February, 1258, the Jami Tower came apart. The eastern wall was open. Mongol soldiers surged through the gap and took the entire eastern line of defense before nightfall. The city could no longer be held. Only now, far too late, did the Caliph send men out to ask for terms. He sent the vizier Ibn al-Alqami first, then his own sons, then finally emerged himself on the 17th with 3,000 notables of the city, judges, scholars, and officials, trusting that Hulagu would honor the office, if not the man. The time for terms had ended a week earlier. The notables were led aside and killed. The machine had already moved to its next task. Here, the prosecution lays down its central charge, the sack itself. What followed has been written down by chroniclers who reached for words and could not find them. For at least a week, the city was given over to destruction carried out with terrible method. The men who recorded it, writing in the years afterward, do not give us a census. They give us the sound of shock. The historian Ibn Kathir, writing a century later in Damascus, put the dead at 800,000. Others wrote of 1 million. Later hands raised the number to 2 million souls. Whatever the real figure, and no one can now recover it, the outcome was the emptying of one of the greatest cities the world had ever built. The population was driven out into the fields beyond the walls and sorted there like goods on a dock. The city itself was taken apart. The Grand Mosque was burned. The shrines and tombs of the caliphs were opened. The palaces, packed with the wealth gathered over 5 centuries, were stripped bare and then put to the torch. The hospitals and the bathhouses came down. And then there were the libraries. Baghdad was never only a capital. It was the mind of a civilization. Its collections, the House of Wisdom foremost among them, held the translated wisdom of Greece, Persia, and India, works on medicine, on the movement of the stars, on mathematics, on law. The prosecution offers the image that has come to stand for the whole loss: Mongol soldiers carrying books out by the armful and throwing them into the Tigris. So many, the accounts say, that the river ran dark with dissolving ink for days, and that a man could ride across the water on the crush of drowned volumes. For a week, the smoke over Baghdad did not clear, and the survivors who crept out of hiding said the air itself smelled of ash and wet paper. Juvayni, who had saved books from Alamut, would soon be made governor of the very city he had watched fall. The last act was carried out on one man. The Caliph al-Musta'sim was brought before Hulagu with his surviving sons. He was made to look on while the city he had ruled was dismantled beyond its walls. There is a story, passed down through several chroniclers, that Hulagu had the caliph's treasury opened before him, the legendary hoard of gold and jewels hidden in a dry cistern, and then set a plate of that same gold in front of the starving man and told him to eat it. When al-Musta'sim said gold was not food, Hulagu asked why. Then he had not spent it on soldiers and swords to defend his walls. The tale may be a later invention. Its point survived because it was true in spirit. The Caliph had trusted his gold and his God, and neither had put a single man on the ramparts. Once his usefulness was spent, there remained only the question of how he would die. Mongol custom carried a deep prohibition against spilling royal blood onto the ground. A king could be killed, but it had to be done in a way that did not offend that order. So the Caliph of Islam, the 37th of a line that had held power for 500 years, was not run through or beheaded. He was rolled tight inside a stack of felt carpets, bound until he was a shape and no longer a man. Then he was laid down in the road, and the Mongol horsemen rode over him at a gallop. The law was kept. Whatever left his body stayed inside the felt and never touched the earth. With that, the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad was finished. On this, the prosecution rests. A city erased, a dynasty snuffed out, a civilization brought to the dust. This channel is built on one idea. History is not a shelf of myths. It is a stack of cold cases waiting for someone patient enough to reopen them. We follow the evidence wherever it goes, even when it leads somewhere no one wants to look. If that is who you are, if you would rather dig for the truth than repeat the legend, then I want you inside the lineage. It is our membership circle, the people who keep this work alive. Join, and you stop being only a viewer. You become part of the team, one of the patrons who make these long investigations possible. You get early access to every documentary we release, along with other perks. And you make sure these stories are told with the depth they are owed. If you feel the pull, press the join button and become part of the family. The case looks closed. The testimony of the dead, set down by the chroniclers who outlived them, describes the end of a world. Every door in the room seems locked, but no trial ends with the prosecution. The defense has the right to speak, and it is about to call its first witness, a man who was not hiding in a cellar in Baghdad while the fires spread, a man who stood in the Mongol camp holding a pen and who counted the dead with his own eyes, a man who drew his wages from the conquerors themselves, and whose numbers, when we finally read them closely, may not say at all what everyone has spent 7 centuries assuming they said. The defense now calls its first witness. His name is Ata-Malik Juvayni. He is a Persian historian, and his book, The History of the World Conqueror, stands among the most detailed and immediate accounts of the Mongol wars ever set down. He gives us the campaign against Baghdad from close range, in granular detail, from the level of a man who was there. His testimony is indispensable. It is also compromised at the root. Because when Juvayni wrote his history, he was not a scholar watching from a safe distance. He was a senior officer of the Mongol government. He had already spent years in the administration at Karakorum, the empire's capital deep in the Mongolian steppe, and he had crossed the length of Asia on official business more than once. He was inside Hulagu Khan's camp while the walls of Baghdad came down, and soon after the city fell, that same Hulagu made him the new governor of Baghdad, handing him the ruins and the survivors to administer. Consider what that means for every line he wrote. Juvayni was not only a historian, he was a collaborator. He was drafting a report for the men who signed his orders, shaping a catastrophe into a form that made their rule look lawful. His pages are not the cry of a man who lost everything. They are the after-action summary of the side that won, and they must be read with that fact held to the light, like a coin turned to catch the flaw in its stamp. His family had served Persian bureaucracies for generations, bending to whichever conqueror held the reins. His father collected taxes for the Mongols before him, and his brother, Shams al-Din, would rise to become finance minister of the whole Persian domain. Juvayni knew in his blood how to survive a change of masters. That skill is written into every sentence he chose to keep and every sentence he chose to leave out. He would govern Baghdad for 2 decades and die in disgrace, hounded by rivals in the same machine he had served, accused of embezzling the funds he administered. A man like that does not write to condemn his employers. He writes to keep his post. With this witness on the stand, the defense turns away from the killer and toward the victim. The prosecution painted a brilliant city, the beating heart of a civilization cut down at the height of its powers. The defense answers that the patient was already dying long before anyone drew a blade. The Abbasid Caliphate of 1258 was an empire of appearances. The caliph's spiritual standing was still honored across the Sunni world, but his worldly power had drained away centuries earlier. Real command over armies and provinces had long since passed to Turkic sultans and Persian warlords, who used the caliph's name and ignored his wishes. For 200 years, the caliphs had lived as ornaments in their own capital. The Buyid emirs, who seized Baghdad in 945, kept the caliphs as tame figureheads, and one of them, Ahmad ibn Buya, had a caliph named al-Musta'sim blinded and dragged from his throne before the whole court. The Seljuk sultans who came after ruled through them just as coldly, riding into the city to receive robes of honor from men who could not refuse them. One earlier caliph, al-Nasir, who reigned for nearly half a century around the year 1200, had clawed back a shred of real power through cunning and patience, weaving networks of loyalty across the guilds. But al-Musta'sim had none of that steel. He gave orders that stopped at the palace gate. His writ barely reached the edge of Iraq, and even that grip was loose. Contemporaries described him as a man fonder of music, of trained pigeons, and of the company of singers than of the armies gathering on his frontier. He surrounded himself with advisers who told him what he wished to hear, and he believed them to the end. But the deeper failure was not in the palace. It was in the earth itself. The vast web of canals that had made Mesopotamia the granary of the ancient world had been rotting for over a century. War, neglect, and endless infighting had let the system decay. The Narawan Canal, the great eastern artery that had watered the plains beyond the Tigris, since the days of the Persian kings, had been breached during a civil war in the 10th century and never fully mended. Once a canal like that fails, the failure spreads. The fields it fed dry out, the villages empty, and there are fewer hands left to dig the next silted channel clear. A dead canal breeds more dead canals. Picture what that decay looked like on the ground. Channels that once ran straight and clean, filled with silt until they were shallow ditches choked with reeds. With the water no longer draining as it should, the level beneath the fields rose and it carried salt to the surface. Land that had fed millions for 3,000 years crusted over with a pale rime that glittered under the sun and crunched underfoot like frost that never melted. Farmers walked out to fields gone white and dead. Whole villages that appear in the tax rolls of the 10th century had vanished from the records by the 13th, their names surviving only as marks on old surveys. The geographer Yakut, who traveled through Iraq only decades before the siege, described stretches of once rich countryside as ruined and abandoned. Great towns shrunk to a handful of houses among the mounds of the dead ones. Baghdad itself had lost whole districts to flood and neglect, and swamps had swallowed land where markets once stood. The agricultural base that had built the city was already broken. The Baghdad of 1258 was not the wonder of the 9th century. It was a shrunken place, living inside walls built for a greatness it had already lost, haunted by a power that had left it long ago. Now the defense begins to take apart the prosecution's evidence, piece by piece. Start with the numbers. 2 million dead is the anchor of the whole case. It suggests something total. A people erased from the earth. It is also impossible. The most generous modern estimates put Baghdad's population in the mid-13th century, after all those decades of decline, between 500,000 and perhaps 700,000. The city did not hold 2 million people to be killed. The bodies the chroniclers describe could not have existed because the living never did in those numbers. So where do the figures come from? Not from any Mongol tally of the dead, they come from a way of writing. To the medieval chronicler, a number was not always a measurement. It was a tool for carrying a moral weight. When the later historian Wasaf, writing in Persia around the year 1300, gives 800,000 dead, he is not counting corpses in a field. He is trying to make his reader feel the size of the wound. He is saying the killing was so wide that it felt as though the world itself had been emptied. Rashid al-Din, the great vizier historian writing a few decades after the event, offers his own inflated figures, and he too drew his salary from the Mongol dynasty. Even Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, the famous astronomer who had joined Hulagu's court and stood in the camp during the siege, gives numbers that stagger the mind. And he had every reason to make his patron's victory look total. These are the language of grief, dressed in the robes of record. The numbers are a monument raised out of exaggeration, because no honest count could hold the meaning of what had happened. Now the most famous image of all, the Tigris turned black with the ink of 1,000,000 drowned books, the picture that anchors the claim that this was above all a war on knowledge. Examine the sources, and something strange surfaces. The earliest accounts of the sack, Juvayni's among them, do not mention it. They describe burning palaces and looted treasuries, but this one cinematic detail is missing from the men who stood closest to the event. It first appears in chronicles written a generation or more later, and it grows richer with each retelling, until a horseman can supposedly ride across the river on the floating mass of books, and the water is said to run red on one bank from blood and black on the other from ink. This does not mean no books were lost. They were, along with everything else of value in a city being stripped to its bones. But the river of ink is almost certainly a legend. It is a way of giving a shape you can see to a loss you cannot measure, and it follows a pattern that stretches back centuries. Nearly the same story was told of the Library of Alexandria, whose scrolls were said to have heated the city's bathhouses for 6 months. The same shape of tale attaches to fallen city after fallen city. It is what the human mind reaches for when it needs to describe a thing too large to describe, the sense that a whole world of learning has been washed downstream, true in feeling, not, the defense argues, true in fact, and here is the sharper point the defense drives home. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, the very astronomer standing in Hulagu's camp, was permitted to save books, and he carried off instruments and manuscripts from Baghdad's collections. To stock a new observatory the Mongols let him build at Maraga in northwestern Persia. He gathered scholars there from across the empire, including men from China, and produced astronomical tables used for centuries afterward. The knowledge did not all vanish into the river. Some of it was loaded onto the conqueror's own wagons and put back to work, and many of the great works of Arabic science already lived in copies in Cairo, in Damascus, in Cordoba, in the libraries of Persia. The learning had scattered long before the siege engines arrived. If this was not a blind rampage, then what drove it? The defense answers, not fury, but policy. For 50 years, from the rivers of China to the forests of Russia, the Mongol Empire had run on one doctrine, simple and consistent and pitiless. When their army arrived before a city, they offered terms. Those who submitted at once were folded into the empire. Their rulers might be swapped out, their young men drafted, their households taxed, but the city itself stood. Its craftsmen, its traders, its clerks were treated as assets worth keeping. But any city that resisted, that made the Mongols spend time and lives and stone throwers on a siege, was turned into a lesson. That lesson had a fixed grammar. The garrison was killed to the last man. The people were slaughtered or marched off in chains. The walls came down. The world had already watched it work. When the trading city of Nishapur in eastern Persia rose in revolt and killed a son-in-law of Genghis Khan in 1221, the whole population was put to the sword, and the chronicles say the ground was leveled so that not even cats and dogs were left alive. Merv, Herat, Gorganj, Bukhara, city after city had been made into that same warning. None of this was hidden. It was the whole point. The terror was the message, and the message was aimed at the next city on the road. Look at what defiance bought here, and choose better. Baghdad, the most celebrated and prestigious city in the region, was by that logic marked to become the greatest lesson of all. Its fame guaranteed the scale of its ruin the moment the Caliph chose to refuse. The destruction was not an accident of war. It was the objective the whole march had been built to reach, and that cold purpose shows itself most clearly in how the sack was actually run. The prosecution's frenzied mob is a false picture. What unfolded across Baghdad in February 1258 was too orderly to be a riot. It was a procedure. After the first killing, the survivors were driven out of the city and gathered on the surrounding plains. There they were not cut down at random. They were sorted. Mongol clerks, working alongside Persian and Chinese administrators, moved through the crowds conducting a grim inventory of human beings. Watch the process rather than the blood. Weavers, metalworkers, engineers, armorers, The men whose hands held skills the empire wanted were pulled aside and counted as property. They were marched off to workshops in Persia, some as far as Karakoram, thousands of miles from the streets where they had learned their trades. The Mongols had done exactly this with the artisans of Samarkand and Bukhara a generation earlier, seeding their own settlements with captured skill the way a farmer seeds a field. Young women and children were separated to be sold or handed out among the Mongol nobles. Some communities were spared by deliberate order. Hulagu's principal wife, Dikes Khatun, was a Nestorian Christian, and at her word, the Christians of Baghdad were largely protected, told to gather in a church that was placed off limits and left standing. The head of the Eastern Church, the Catholicos Makika, kept his life and his flock, and was even given one of the caliph's own palaces as a residence. Word of this mercy reached Europe, where a few crusaders began to imagine wrongly that the Mongols might be turned into allies against Islam. Envoys would soon pass between Hulagu's court and the kings of the West, chasing an alliance that never came. This was not the work of a mob that had lost its head. It was a bureaucracy carrying out an inventory at sword point. The true weight of the sack of Baghdad is not in the chaos, it is in the order. It is the figure of a clerk with a wax tablet and a stylus, standing at the shoulder of a captain, calmly separating a mother from a son, marking a craftsman for deportation and a household for sale, processing a living city the way a steward processes a herd. There is a further detail the sources record with cold precision. The smell of the dead grew so heavy after a week that Hulagu pulled his own camp back and moved upwind of the city. Only later, when the streets had been cleared enough to bear it, did he ride in to inspect the prize he had won, walking through the plundered palace of the caliphs where the mosaics still glittered under the ash. Even the aftermath was managed on a schedule. The defense does not rest on a claim of innocence. It rests on a redefinition of the crime. This was not the rage of barbarians. It was a calculated act of state terror, carried out by the most efficient administrative machine of its age. If you want to understand the machine that took Baghdad, you have to read its blueprints. The primary source that anchors this investigation, a deep archive of the Mongol conquests, is available for you to own right now. Click the View Products button on your screen. This book is a landmark of historical documentation, holding the very chronicles that let us put this event on trial and cross-examine the men who wrote it. Owning it is the surest way to grasp the full scope of the story. And while you are there, look over the rest of the shelf. We have gathered a selection of immersive pieces and dark memorabilia to round out your collection. Open the shop, browse the artifacts, and stay with us as the investigation moves to its close. The defense has made its case. It has argued that the victim was already dying, that the evidence was reshaped by grief into myth, and that the killer was not a monster but a machine running a program written years before it reached the Tigris. The charge was the murder of a civilization. The defense calls it a political execution carried out to specification. The arguments have all been heard. The evidence has been turned over and held to the light. But a trial is not finished when the lawyers sit down. There remains the matter of the outcome. What grew from soil soaked in that much blood? Who walked back into the emptied streets, and who carried east the wealth the Mongols stripped from the palaces? History's verdict is never clean, and it is never delivered by the men who fought the battle. It is written slowly in the lives of those who inherited the ashes and had to make something out of them. And 2 years after Baghdad fell, one of those inheritors was riding out of Egypt toward a spring in Galilee, carrying an answer that no one in Hulagu's camp believed the world could still produce. The trial is over. The prosecution has argued for an apocalypse. The defense has argued for a calculated execution of state. Now the case passes to the only jury that ever really decides anything, the people who had to live in the world the killing left behind. And the first of those inheritors to step forward and seize the future was not a king or a caliph. It was an army of former slaves. 2 years after Baghdad fell in 1260, a Mongol force under Hulagu's trusted general Kitbuka pushed south through Syria and into Palestine, aiming at the last great prize of the West, Egypt. Along the way, it took Aleppo after a brief siege and entered Damascus without a fight, its Ayyubid ruler having fled. For a moment, it seemed nothing between the Tigris and the Nile could stand. But Hulagu himself had turned back east. Word had reached him that his brother, the great Khan Mongol, was dead, killed on campaign in southern China, and the succession was thrown open between his other brothers, Kublai and Arik Boki. Hulagu rode to guard his stake in that quarrel, taking the bulk of his army with him and leaving Kitbuka with a fraction of the force that had crushed Baghdad. That single decision would cost the Mongols the whole western march. The army that remained met the Mamluk Sultanate of Cairo at a place in Galilee called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, on the 3rd of September, 1260. The Mamluks were something the world had not seen before. They were an army of Turkic slave soldiers, boys bought on the steppe frontier north of the Black Sea, shipped south, converted to Islam, raised in barracks, drilled from childhood in the saddle and the bow, then freed to serve as a warrior caste that answered to no clan but its own. In 1250, they had overthrown their masters, the last of Saladin's Ayyubid line, murdering the Sultan Turan Shah and taking Egypt for themselves. They fought the way the Mongols fought because they came from the same grasslands and the same hard schooling. They knew the feigned retreat. They knew the encircling storm of arrows that emptied a saddle before a man could close. At Ain Jalut, they turned those weapons against the men who had made them terrible. The Mamluk commander, Kutuz, hid the greater part of his force in the folds of the hills and sent a smaller body forward under his general Baibars to bait the Mongols into charging. Kitbuka took the bait and drove his cavalry hard after the retreating line. When the Mongols were deep in the low ground, the hidden wings closed on them from both flanks at once. There is a story, passed down by the Mamluk chroniclers, that at the crisis of the fighting, when one wing of his own army buckled and men began to run, Kutuz flung his helmet to the dust so his soldiers could see his bare face and cried out for Islam 3 times until the line steadied and held. Whether the scene is exact or burnished in the retelling, the outcome is beyond dispute. For the first time in open battle, a Mongol army was not merely beaten, it was broken and hunted across the Galilean hills. Kitbuka was taken alive, brought before Kutuz, and put to death, defiant to the last, warning his captors that Hulagu would avenge him. The tide that had rolled west out of Mongolia for 50 years stopped at a spring in northern Palestine and never came so far again. The news of it ran through the Islamic world like water finding a crack in stone. It announced a champion. The Mamluks were now the first power on earth to have shattered a Mongol field army, and they wore that fact like a second suit of armor. Their true master emerged from the aftermath through blood. Baibars, the general who had commanded the bait at Ain Jalut, had expected the governorship of Aleppo as his reward. When Kutuz refused him, Baibars ambushed the Sultan during a hunt on the road back to Cairo and killed him with his own hand, then took the throne. Baibars was cunning, sleepless, and pitiless toward rivals. He rebuilt the roads of his realm and set up a relay post system copied straight from the Mongols, so a rider could carry a message from Cairo to Damascus in 4 days. He bred carrier pigeons for warnings that had to move faster still and kept a register of every bird. He drove the last Crusader strongholds back toward the sea, taking Antioch in 1268. He understood that a victory in the field fades unless it is bolted to something older and deeper than a battle. He needed legitimacy. He found it in a ghost. A few years after Ain Jalut, a man arrived in Cairo claiming to be an uncle of the last Caliph of Baghdad, a survivor who had slipped out of the massacre. Baibars saw the opening at once. He staged a public ceremony in the citadel, had the man's lineage examined by the judges and declared genuine, and installed him as the new Abbasid Caliph under the title al-Musta'sim. The new caliph, in turn, formally invested Baibars with authority over the Muslim lands. It was a hollow office dressed in gold. The man had no army, no territory, no power beyond the robes on his back. When Baibars sent him east with a small escort to try to reclaim Baghdad itself, he rode straight into a Mongol patrol and vanished, presumed killed. Baibars simply appointed another kinsman and moved on. The symbol was what mattered, not the man wearing it. The caliphate the Mongols had trampled into, felt on a Baghdad road, had risen again, this time under Mamluk guard. For the next 2.5 centuries, shadow caliphs of the House of Abbas would live in Cairo, lending the sacred weight of their name to whichever sultan held the swords. The ghost of Baghdad had found a landlord, and that landlord was the state that had first broken the machine. A second inheritor was already at work far to the east, and his story turns the whole legend inside out. He did not sit on a throne. He stood in an observatory. His name was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and he was among the sharpest minds of the century. An astronomer, a mathematician, a philosopher who wrote on logic, on ethics, and on the movement of the heavens. For years he had lived as a guarded guest inside the assassin fortress of Alamut, half prisoner and half prize, composing his books under the watch of the men who held him. When Hulagu's army came to break the assassins in 1256, al-Tusi did not choose martyrdom. He chose survival and then advancement. Some sources say he counseled the assassin leader to surrender, easing the fall of the very castle that had confined him. He walked out of it and into Mongol service as Hulagu's personal astrologer and scientific advisor. He was in the camp during the siege of Baghdad. He watched the smoke climb over the walls, and he lived. Then he did the thing no one expects. Al-Tusi went to Hulagu, the man who had presided over the ruin of the House of Wisdom, and asked him to fund the finest observatory the world had yet seen. He knew his patron's mind. He framed the request not as pure scholarship, but as a tool for reading the will of the stars, a thing a Mongol Khan understood and prized above almost anything. Hulagu agreed. Drawing on the treasury of the new realm and on endowment funds, al-Tusi was allowed to gather from religious properties. Construction of the observatory at Maraga began in 1259 on a hilltop in the northwest of Persia. It was no lone tower. It held libraries said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes, lecture halls, workshops for casting brass instruments, and lodgings for scholars summoned from across the known world. Among them, astronomers brought overland from China, who carried calculating methods the Persians had never seen. Its instruments were built to a scale no earlier observatory had dared, mural quadrants fixed into the very rock, because the larger the instrument, the finer the reading of the sky. Al-Tusi sent agents out to gather books wherever the campaigns had scattered them, and manuscripts pulled from the wreck of Baghdad's own collections came to rest on Maraga's shelves. The very conquest that legend says turned the Tigris black with ink was now paying for the next leap in the science it was supposed to have drowned. At Maraga, al-Tusi and his team labored for 12 years and produced a set of astronomical tables, the Ilkhanic tables, so accurate they were copied for generations across Asia and even reached Byzantium. They also built a geometric device, later called the Tusi couple, that let them model planetary motion and resolve a flaw the ancient Greek astronomers had never solved. That model traveled west across the centuries and surfaced, unmistakably, in a diagram in the work of Nicholas Copernicus nearly 300 years later. The knowledge had not been erased on the riverbank. It had changed employers and kept working. The third inheritor, and the deepest, was the Mongol dynasty itself. Hulagu never went home to the steppe. He carved his own kingdom out of the empire, the Ilkhanate, and ruled Persia, Iraq, and Anatolia from courts at Maraga and later Tabriz. He died in 1265 and was buried by an old steppe custom on an island in Lake Urmia with a hoard of treasure that has never been found, and a report says captives were killed at the grave to serve him in death. His wife, Dikes Khatun, who had shielded the Christians of Baghdad, died within months of him, and the Christian communities of the East mourned the pair as protectors, even as Muslims cursed Hulagu's name. He and his first heirs were Buddhists and Christians, a thin foreign elite set over a Muslim population that outnumbered them past counting. No empire can be governed forever by strangers to the faith of the ruled. Within 2 generations, the conquerors began to be conquered by the culture beneath their feet. The turning point came in the summer of 1295, when the Ilkhan ruler Ghazan Khan stood before his commanders and his court and converted to Islam, and much of the Mongol aristocracy converted alongside him. The single act remade the state. The Mongol rulers of Persia were no longer occupiers of an alien creed. They were an Islamic dynasty, and they threw themselves into patronizing the civilization their grandfathers had assaulted. They raised mosques whose tilework caught the light like cut jewels. They rebuilt canals and cities the campaigns had wrecked. Ghazan reformed the debased coinage, fixed the tax system so peasants were no longer plundered at will, and tried to mend the very countryside his ancestors had salted. They funded some of the most richly illustrated manuscripts in the history of Islamic art, painted in workshops where Persian brushwork met Chinese landscape, learned along the trade roads their own empire had thrown open. They made Tabriz a crossroads where merchants from Genoa haggled beside caravans from Cathay, and where a European envoy could meet a Chinese astronomer in the same courtyard. The vacuum that the sack of Baghdad had torn open was filled, in the end, by the descendants of the men who had torn it. Here lies the sharpest turn of the whole story. The most detailed histories we possess of the sack of Baghdad, the vivid and terrible accounts by men like Rashid al-Din, were commissioned by these later Muslim Mongol Khans. Rashid al-Din was himself a vizier of the Ilkhanate, born a Jew, trained as a physician, converted to Islam, and risen to the summit of the state. Ghazan ordered him to compile a history of the world, the Jami al-Tawarikh, the first history that tried to hold the whole span of Eurasia inside one book, from the Franks to the Chinese. He paid for its copying and illustration out of a whole endowed quarter of Tabriz that he built for scholarship. The Rabbi Rashidi, staffed with hundreds of scribes and copyists who were required to produce fresh copies every year, so the work could never be lost. Rashid al-Din would end torn apart by a court faction in 3918, his quarter looted, his son later killed. But the histories survived him. The rulers had paid their court historians to record the brutality of their own ancestors, preserving the catastrophe as the founding chapter of their dynasty's own story. The killer's grandchildren became the archivists of the killing. So what is the verdict? What was truly lost in 1258? The prosecution charged the murder of a civilization. That charge cannot stand. The Islamic world was already vast, varied, and moving its centers of gravity outward in every direction. The Golden Age, if it was ever a single thing, had long been branching, with learning and power rising in Cairo, in Muslim Spain, in Central Asia, decades before a Mongol reached the Tigris. In Cordoba and Toledo, scholars had already been translating Arabic science into Latin for 100 years, and those translations were teaching medicine and astronomy to a Europe that could not yet match them. The fall of Baghdad did not end that spread. It confirmed it. What died in 1258 was not Islamic civilization. It was Baghdad's 500-year reign as the single undisputed heart of that civilization. The city that had given the era its name was never its capital again. The pieces scattered, and each one found new soil. Political weight moved decisively to Cairo, where the Mamluks would hold the line against Mongol and Crusader alike for 2.5 centuries until the Ottomans took them in 1517. Scientific fire burned brightest at Marega, then leapt east to Samarkand, where a century and a half later the Prince Ulugh Beg built an observatory, greater still, and charted more than 1,000 stars from a sextant sunk into a trench in the rock. Later, it moved again to Istanbul under the Ottoman sultans. The world of Islam became multipolar, answering no longer to one river or one throne. The sack of Baghdad was not a cultural murder. It was a political execution, the violent and final close of an age of centrality and the opening of an age with many centers. The sentence of this trial lands on a single paradox. The Mongol Empire was a machine that ran on writing. It was obsessed with records, with census rolls, with tax registers, with official histories, and careful correspondence carried across continents by relay riders changing horses at fixed stations. Its most famous act in the West was the destruction of the greatest archive the Islamic world possessed. The burning of the libraries was the strangest thing a paper-hungry bureaucracy could have done. And yet nearly everything we know about that week, every detail we have used to weigh this case, survives only because that same administration wrote it down. It survives in the works of the court historians the Mongols employed, on paper the empire's own mills produced, kept safe in the libraries its later rulers paid to build. Juvayni wrote as their governor. Rashid al-Din wrote as their vizier. The machine that erased a city's memory became the chief author of that memory. The story of the horde that supposedly hated books reaches us only because the heirs of that horde could not stop making them. The last image belongs not to the conquerors, but to the ground itself. Baghdad did not die in 1258. Within a few years, people drifted back into the emptied quarters, and markets reopened along the river under Juvayni's administration. But the great irrigation works were never rebuilt to what they had been. The salt stayed in the fields. The city that had held perhaps 500,000 souls shrank to a provincial town on a river that no longer fed an empire, and in 1401 The conqueror Timur would come and break it again, raising towers of skulls outside its walls. Its silence was the truest verdict of all. Not a scream, but a smaller call to prayer echoing off fewer walls in a place that had once told the whole world where the center of the world was. Thank you for staying to the very end of this investigation. If the work of separating the legend from the record earned your respect, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and send this video to one person who still believes the version everyone was taught. Tell us in the comments where you come down, apocalypse or execution. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The story does not stop at the Tigris. The forces set loose by the fall of Baghdad went on to remake empires from the Nile to the steppe, and the next chapter is already waiting for you. Click the video appearing on your screen now and step into what came after. Watch it now.